Not long ago, this was a motorway. Here too. And this parking lot will soon be a park. All of these places were once rivers, filled or covered to make room for cars. Now, their spaces being reclaimed for people. Let me tell you how this happened and how you can do the same thing. I first visited the city that I now call home in 2016. At the time, Nantes didn't stand out much in my mind. In fact, I'll go as far as to say that I found it kind of uncomfortable. The center of Nantes at the time honestly felt like an American downtown. Roads were dominated by cars, very few people were walking around. Even steps outside the train station, the front porch of any European city, looked like this. In 2024, that couldn't be further from reality. And in fact, Nantes seems to be on a fast track toward creating a calm, lush, and accessible city connected by transit, bike infrastructure, and footpaths, where the non-driver is priority number one in the mobility hierarchy in the eyes of the local government. I'm so glad that I kept coming back here. Between 2016 and 2024, I visited Nantes on average about 1 to 2 times per year, both for work and for leisure. And every year, the city seemingly became more and more accessible. By 2021, I was blown away by how different it was. The car sewer in front of the train station had nearly vanished, now being replaced by the most beautiful front porch in France. A linear park traversed the city center. The city center itself, nearly completely car-free, was now a space for people. Walking, rolling, and biking connections between green spaces and greenery in general seemed to be spilling out in front of me everywhere I looked. COVID bike lanes and pedestrian spaces were also starting to become permanent. School streets were popping up to give kids safe options for play and for getting to school. 80% of roads had speeds limited to 30 kilometers an hour, meaning the maximum speed allowed on nearly all streets in Nantes is slower than the minimum speed allowed on residential streets in most, if not all, American cities. And it was here on this street, while the folks that I was with from the mobility department casually talked to an elected official on her cargo bike, fresh from picking her kids up from school, where I fell head over heels for this city. For me, this sort of action is huge. Throughout my life, I was one of the 1 in 3 Americans who couldn't drive. I was born legally blind with a condition known as nystagmus, and following a surgery in my childhood, I'm now considered low vision. This disability disqualifies me from driving, which, of course, made moving through space in the US much more time-consuming, inconvenient, and even dangerous. On any given day in Nantes, you can see plenty of people using wheelchairs, others using white canes, and others using any number of other mobility devices. This is a big change for someone coming from America, where people with disabilities are often isolated due to a lack of accessible spaces within proximity of their homes. There's a tangible sense of mobility freedom here, and replacing spaces for cars with places for people is only the first step toward welcoming people of varying mobility needs. Nantes is still not perfectly accessible, but along with these changes, there is an intention within municipal government to make the city more accessible. That's literally life-altering for many people. Already, city center pedestrianization and limiting speeds to 30 kilometers an hour is a huge step toward making people outside of cars safer. A huge feat that is almost impossible to consider in North America. But they're also in the process of opening 2 new tramways. Bike lanes are starting to weave a web across the city. Modal filtering is commonplace in neighborhoods across the city, and small squares, parks, or pathways can be found all over the metropolis. Great places for chatting with neighbors, for kids to play, and to even just hear yourself think. So not only is Nantes changing the rules that lead to safer streets, they're doing the harder part in building infrastructure that limits the chance of major collisions. The prioritization of the non-driver is tangible. I've walked and biked throughout Nantes in northern, southern, and western suburbs. I've even biked 100 kilometers east to Angers. Even on the widest, biggest streets in the city or surrounding towns, it's still not even as scary as being a non-driver on a typical American residential street. And nowhere near as terrifying as non-driver death traps like Rainier, Aurora, or MLK Way in my hometown of Seattle. Sure, a lot of this change happened during COVID. Nantes, much like Paris, it was run by an ecologist socialist coalition at the time who made this a priority when everyone was in lockdown. But not all of it was done during COVID. Well before that, their movement had been building. And a lot of the improvements that have happened in this time of rapid change were done via pilots, where residents had the opportunity to weigh in on how particular projects affected them. That's still a core piece of the city's platform. In Nantes, relative political stability and political will opened the door for this opportunity and left it open. But that ability to quickly deploy and then assess projects has been the key ingredient to Nantes' success, in my opinion. Show someone something on a piece of paper years before any groundbreaking, and they'll tear it apart. Give people the opportunity to experience how that change may or may not affect their daily life, then work with a cohort of neighbors, and you'll end up with something that works for everyone. But sure, maybe you're sitting there thinking, that can't happen where I live. Not with that attitude. In any given transportation department in the US, you'll find dedicated staff who understand the need to make streets safer. But ultimately, in the US, city councils set budgets and mayors dictate department work. If you have a city council willing to spend to make streets safer, but a mayor who can't imagine losing free parking for their Tesla, you're not going to get far. Likewise, if you have a mayor who wants to make it safer for kids to walk to school, but a council who can't imagine walking further than the parking garage, you're also stuck. Nantes isn't Disneyland, nor is it some European utopia. It wasn't always like this. Nantes is simply a place where people have elected people who give a shit about this stuff. And if there were electeds that stood in the way of a more calm, more accessible, and more equitable city, I guarantee you that they weren't convinced to do the right thing. That is how you can win. Don't waste time trying to convince electeds who stand against popular public requests. Replace them. Then work with the replacements to democratize access to power so that those popular requests can be fulfilled. And that's it. Sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees, but that's the key ingredient to getting this stuff done. A lot of times we can be greeted by this great infrastructure in a faraway land and forget that it's not the actual building of the infrastructure that's the hard part. It's the organizing that has to take place before. The best way for your community to see any kind of change is through political organizing, right now. Nantes has had a fairly strong leftist ecologist government in place because they organized and they built coalitions. That's it. You too can build a slate of leftist ecologist candidates who will commit to safe streets for kids, a more convenient commute for their parents, and daily essentials within proximity for their grandparents. The first step in that organizing is finding those folks that see something like this project in Nantes for what it is: a path toward greater mobility for all, a means for economic stability, a method of community safety and activation, a way to build a city within reach. So the real question is that you?